Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. So today we're going to be talking about Islamic schools or Muslim schools, or what I call Muslimic schools, as a key part of determining where Muslims should live within Sydney. What I'm going to do is I'm going to break this presentation up in probably 2 to 3 main parts for tonight. I'm going to obviously try to keep it as short as possible. So the first part, which will be the introduction, would be just a quick recap of the 10-year plan and how we've come to the topic of Islamic schools. And I'll sort of go through the content very fast, but also give it a slant or a bias towards talking about schools and how it's relevant to all of this. The second part of the presentation would be a deep dive into schools, Islamic schools in particular, or Muslim schools that exist within Sydney, comparing them, explaining the methodology behind the comparison, the key metrics, and the rest of it. So what I'll then do, the last part, is if we have time, I'll go through my Instagram. I've been doing some polling in terms of some of the key questions that need to be answered when determining schools, and we can sort of see what the vibe is of people on that part. So as I said, the first part of the presentation will be just a quick recap of the 10-year plan. If you want a full detailed explanation, I already got a live stream from last week that covers a lot more detail of it. So if you want to sort of refer to the details, then do that. Otherwise, I'll spend about 5 minutes or so just going through it. So the key question is, why do we live why we live? And there's many different ways that one can answer that. For some people, it's convenient. Some people, it's economic reasons. Some people, it's the fact that they want to live around Muslims. For everyone, it's a range of reasons, I guess. And the subsequent question after that is there somewhere that you could live that would be better for your well-being or your family's well-being? And if the answer to that is yes, then there needs to be a set of questions that are sort of, or a criteria that needs to sort of determine how you judge suburbs relative to one another. And then from that, you can obviously start comparing and contrasting and comparing suburbs. So one such comparison that I'm doing is called the 10-year plan. And what the idea here is that how do we sort of socially engineer a better Muslim community? Now, to put the slant from the school perspective, schools are a very valuable part of any person's development. So if you look at your best friends, if you look at people that you network with, people that help you out with business, people that you benefited from or were harmed from, a lot of that can stem back to the context of school. Like for example, you go to a wedding and the best man's speech is usually by someone who was a friend of the groom at the in high school or something like that. Or in many instances of many weddings that I go to, the bride and the groom sort of became acquainted with each other during school. So like people's first crushes, all these other things happen at school. Obviously, this is in addition to the education, which is a core component of what determines potentially one's success in university and further studies and the rest of it. So I guess schools have a very important role in those formative years that a child or an adolescent goes through. And so as a parent, determining what school your child goes to it will largely or significantly determine their future and what they sort of achieve and their friend circle, the social aspect of it as well. So socially engineering something would be something like, would you want your child to go to a particular school? If so, it would make sense for you to live closely to it. I was speaking to a brother actually about this, and he was talking to me about how by the time his child is in high school, even if the high school is far away, he doesn't care, because by that time you have self-driving cars and the rest of it. But I guess like if you're sort of looking at the present and you've got a child, maybe you already have a child that's in school, maybe you have a child that is an infant or a toddler, and now you're sort of weighing up the different schools and what's available. This presentation will be very useful for that, because it will look into various things that are publicly available, and then there's some qualitative stuff that we can sort of deal with as well. With schools as well, like the warnings I typically give in every presentation, there's some issues with underlying data. So for example, I'm going to be talking at length about NAPLAN results. And I'm not saying that standardized testing is the only way of judging students and their performance, but it is a way. And the other aspect of it is you got to keep in mind NAPLAN is not like the HSC. So in NAPLAN, there are particular biases that the schools can have in the underlying data in terms of if students are given extra time, all these other things. And so, and not making any allegations here or anything like that, but the idea here is that the NAPLAN results are not like the standardized testing that occurs in the HSC under the HSC conditions. So there might be issues with underlying data there if schools want to manipulate that slightly. There's also the fact that data changes. What I've also done is I've looked at probably the last few years of data. So I've looked at longitudinal data when it comes to high school performance results, NAPLAN results, and you can sort of see particular patterns or trends emerging from that. And I've got those in graphs as well. The other thing is that, as I always say, that like this is a sensitive topic. So if you're a parent and you've sort of done your due diligence and put your child in a particular school, and then you see that the data doesn't support that school, or the data set suggests particular things about that school, then I'm not sort of making a personal judgment on you as a parent or your parenting ability or the future of your child. It's just that this is a sensitive topic, but hopefully we can sort of have it in a mature way. Conflict of interest, as I always mentioned, obviously we, as on a personal basis, I do service schools from here and there, and so naturally there is an inherent conflict of bias. But I guess the idea here is that the methodology of research and determining the way that I come to particular conclusions will also be clear. So you could sort of replicate this independent of what I'm saying and come to the same conclusions, more or less. So that's on the quantitative side. On the qualitative side, yes, there will be inherent biases, and I'll sort of point those out as I go. And as I always say, do your own research. I could be making any of these numbers up. Hopefully I'm not, and I'll show you the way that I have. But it's also important that this isn't financial advice or anything like that. So you just got to keep that in mind. The rest, now I'm going to fly through. The idea here is obviously that like there's a balancing act that you're trying to do as a parent, where you sort of come to realize, and you'll see this with schools, a lot of the great schools are outside the Muslim suburbs. And so there's always this sort of discussion I have with some younger parents. Do you want to move out of the area for those better schools and potentially risk the culturing of your child, whether they sort of stray away from being Muslim or the culture of Islam, etc.? Or do you want to stay within this area and sort of have to be limited to a particular set of schools? So if you want to move to the eastern suburbs, yes, that's great potentially for your child's education. But is it great for your child's tarbiyah, the Islamic upbringing? Probably not. And vice versa. Like, and obviously there's not a sort of mutually exclusive benefit here. Like there are, as I'll show you guys, many great Islamic schools or Muslim schools that are doing quite well and whatnot. So I guess Muslims are growing. Obviously the demand for Islamic schools is growing. Like if you ever try to enroll your child into an Islamic school, many of them you'll find that there's a very long waiting list and there's a due process of entry exams and all these other things. So this is just like compounded obviously within the other points that I've been mentioning. I've talked about why particular Muslim clusters exist in Sydney, largely due to the infrastructure. And obviously I've spoken a lot at length about mosques and the importance of living near a mosque so that you can pray in congregation if you're a male. But the idea here as well that part of that infrastructure is Islamic schools. So if, for instance, Islamic school is built in a particular suburb and there's a mosque and there's other infrastructure, then naturally more Muslims will migrate towards that. There's a YouTube channel I've been following that sort of talks about Sydney trains and the infrastructure of Sydney and goes into analysis of particular suburbs and stuff. Interestingly enough, they've sort of changed my view on something in the last week, which was I always sort of believe that you sort of move Muslims to a particular area and the infrastructure would just come. But the idea here is that if you look at like Marsden Park, that didn't happen. The government didn't build public infrastructure, proper roads. There was only like one road leading out of it. They didn't build proper public transport and all this other stuff. So you had all these sort of people that moved to Marsden Park and they were all complaining about those transport issues. So it's a better way of organizing people is to build the infrastructure and then people will arrive. And so like increasingly, and maybe I'll do a presentation on this in the weeks to come, is like what would be my view of an ideal masjid and how it's funded and how it's built and all this other stuff. Many a time I see many projects where millions of dollars are blown on a massive infrastructure project where perhaps there's not enough demand, perhaps there's questions around whether the money could be spent elsewhere and all these other things. And I think schools are very similar. As I said, I've reviewed literature, and the relevance to schools here would be that when you look at these suburbs, so like Lane Cove, Waverley, etc., remember these suburbs, you'll sort of see that the best schools are there as well. So a lot of the suburbs that talk about where to raise your family within Sydney, they do talk about the fact that you have to have access to a really good school, and you sort of see that as well. So you'll see that in a bit as well. And just touching upon the non-Muslim case study of Eastwood. So if you look at Eastwood Public School, Kent Road, etc., which I'll sort of show in a second, you'll start noticing that the Chinese were very smart in sort of doing their 10-year plan, finding a location. And now if you look at all the public schools, so I'm not even talking about private schools, I'm talking about public schools that you pay like 100 or 200 bucks a year in school fees. These schools are like doing top tier results. They're topping NAPLAN, they're topping many other subjects and stuff like that as well. So it's important to realize the benefit that something like the 10-year plan can have. Going back to the research questions, it's obviously talking about Sydney. So we're not looking at all of Australia. There's a lot of Islamic schools and Muslim schools in other states, obviously. I won't be looking at them. And the other aspect of it is that you're raising a young Muslim family. So as I said before, that if you're a bachelor, if you're a young couple with no kids, this is obviously less relevant to you because you don't need to live near a school for you to sort of be able to live a decent living. So just flying straight through this, we've also talked about like the layout of Sydney, the idea that there's two cities. So there's the eastern half on the eastern side of the Red Rooster line, which has great infrastructure and all these other things. And again, schools will be part of that. You'll see that in a second. And then you've got the western part, which is like less so, obviously, like it's not as good. So if you recall like those suburbs that I was talking about in those articles, I've put those here again. And you'll see again that like these map onto where those particular great schools are as well. So this was the methodology, and I'm just going to focus on the right hand side again. So when we're sort of judging suburbs, we obviously need to have a criteria. And the criteria that I've been using is this as follows, with weightings as well. So what I might actually do is I'll just move my head to the other side. Give me a second, guys. So basically with Islam, so a typical person who's judging suburbs would probably look at 2 to 5 and affordability. The difference here is that as a Muslim, you're sort of adding this aspect of Islam. So you could basically take the results from many other websites and many other channels and many other things that will sort of look at safety and infrastructure and the rest of it. And they'll tell you, okay, this is the best suburb or that is the best suburb. But what they won't do is factor in your Islamic needs. So they won't look at how many Muslims live near you, the infrastructure of schools and mosques, etc. So that's what this presentation is seeking to do, with a particular focus on schools. So just keep going. So as I said, like you can categorize suburbs into one of 4 quadrants. Those based off how good the religiosity or the deen is and how good the dunya is, or from a worldly perspective. And I guess the ideal would be to have a suburb that is high in both regards. And obviously it's about finding what that suburb is, because at the moment there's nothing that stands out particularly well. And touching upon the point of schools, like there's only one of 2 ways that these particular things are going to happen. We're going to find a high school. Either going to have to migrate Muslims to those suburbs that are already good but lack religiosity, and hopefully religiosity would come once the Muslims migrate there, or you would need to gentrify that area. And that's obviously a very difficult thing. You can't just build a school out of scratch and build all the culture and the teacher qualifications and everything that you need for a great school. What you would naturally need to do is find existing schools that are doing quite well, and then basically not infiltrate, but basically migrate to those suburbs and sort of benefit from them and whatnot. I'll skip this. Basically, we're looking at the suburb level for the purpose. We're not looking at postcodes. We're not looking at LGAs. We're looking at the suburb level. And what this visualization just does is that it shows ring fences of where at least 10% of Muslims exist. So those orange lines that show about 5 different clusters, 2 of them being the main cluster. So that is the Canary Bankstown and Cumberland LGAs. And then you've got the sort of out Liverpool towards Austral and down towards like Minto and Campbelltown. So you've got those 2 main clusters. And you'll sort of also see that the Islamic schools obviously follow those clusters, with the exception of Torella and East Lakes, that do have more than 10% Muslims in some suburbs, up to about 21% in Torella. They don't have Sunni Islamic schools. So I'll talk about how in part of the methodology I've excluded some particular schools based off denominations and stuff like that, but I'll come to that in a second. But most of the Islamic schools are centered around like the Auburn area, the Greenacre area, and then obviously you've got various schools out west, and then you've got some schools towards that Hills and Mount Druitt area as well. So that obviously makes intuitive sense. You're going to have Islamic schools where Muslims exist. Then I guess like the other part from last week, last week I think, was that I zoomed in onto that particular cluster of the Canterbury Bankstown / Cumberland LGA, and then we sort of came up with these things. And you can see already the Muslim schools I've put in those light green dots, just to sort of highlight, I guess, where those particular schools are in that particular LGA. Okay, now this is the new part. So I spent about 15 minutes getting to this point, but hopefully it was worth the recap for anyone that hasn't seen it, or at least as a reminder for those who have. Okay, so when we talk about Muslim schools, what are we talking about? So just by means of context, like my experience has been around that sort of education sphere, especially earlier in my career. Obviously, with my wife being a qualified secondary teacher, she's taught at different schools as well. We sort of have this understanding of how schools work. But I guess from a data perspective, I came to realize more intimate details about things that most people won't know through when I was working at a software company. And we're selling, the company is the leading software provider for most schools, has probably the largest market share easily in New South Wales. Most, like about 90+% of public schools are using it. A lot of independent schools have started using it, etc. as well. So the idea here is that gave me access to information that publicly is available, and I obviously can't disclose a lot of that. But when I sort of started working with the sales team from a marketing perspective, the government schools was all about cloud migration, and then the independent schools was like a new frontier for the company. And so a lot of the research that I did was actually looking at independent schools. We basically did this data scrub to look at all the independent schools, the denominations, where they're located, how many fees they charge, how many students they have. And obviously that was for the purposes of then categorizing them. And I recall that the summary of that was that I came up with this categorization matrix where you looked at schools like fish. So we had I can't remember all of them, but you had like the salmons, you had the whales. So I think there was like 3 or 4 whales when it comes to schools. And those were the schools that had the largest number of students and the highest number of fees. But I guess to sort of boil it down to what's relevant here is that in Australia, there's about 100 schools. And I guess that's probably the first question. Would you want to send your child to a school in Australia? And this didn't dawn upon me until I spoke to one of the brothers. I think he's spent a lot of his time around Southeast Asia, Hong Kong, etc. And there's a trade-off. If you read any analysis of how schooling is occurring in Australia, most of them will point a very bleak picture of the fact that in many subjects, Australia is declining. So despite the fact that we have one of the highest GDPs and highest GDP per capita and all these other measurements of material success, from an education perspective, Australia is ranked further down than where it should be, all things considered. And there's many other countries, especially in like the Middle East and Asia, etc., that are doing well despite the fact that they don't have that same GDP per capita and disposable income and all these other things. So I think that's like one of the first questions. Like if you've consolidated in your mind that Australia is the country that you're going to live in, then obviously you're going to sort of consider the fact that you're going to be bound to one of these 10,000 schools. I'll come to homeschooling in a second, but let's just say there's 10,000 schools in Australia, roughly give or take. Then you've got about 1,200 of them that are independent. So what I'm basically saying there is that about 90% of the schools roughly are government or public schools. And then you've got about 1,200 of them which are independent. And when we're talking about independent here, we're sort of talking about the fact that Australia has a 3-service schooling system. So due to historical reasons, there's obviously the government schooling system. So typically a primary school would have the word public or primary after it, or a high school just had the word high school after it. Those are key indicators that that's a public school or a government school. And then you've got the Catholic school system, which is obviously due to Australia's deeply Catholic history. You have this separate system that is based off diocese. So you have like the Wollongong diocese or the Toowoomba diocese. And that's just like clusterings of about 30 or 40 or more schools in that particular region that are all following the Catholic system. So from high school, anyone who set the HSC, you would remember that there was past papers, there was the independent papers, and then there was the Catholic school papers. And a lot of people would recommend the Catholic ones because they're a bit harder. So the idea here is that, and then you've got the third system, which is the independent school system. So the independent school system obviously follows the curriculum, which is set by NESA. and all these other things. But the idea here is that they can function independently of government in certain regards. So they have different fee structures, they have different policies and procedures. They all have to obviously uphold a code of conduct and policies to do with parents and all these other things. But just to summarize, there's three school systems. There's the government school system, there's the Catholic school system, and there's the independent school system. To sort of further complicate this thing, there are some independent, so the independent schools are generally broken down by denominations or philosophies. So you have like schools that are obviously religiously affiliated. So in Australia, we have about 40 or 50 Muslim schools spread across Australia. So as I said, there's a few campuses down in Western Australia. There's many Islamic schools in Melbourne, for example. And then 20 of those Muslim schools are in New South Wales. Some independent, so obviously you've got Muslim independent schools. You also have Catholic independent schools. You have Anglican independent schools. And those Catholic independent schools are not always associated with the diocese as well. So it's an interesting thing there as well. But then you've also got like other philosophies. So you've got humanist philosophies. You've got Steiner, for example, Skeggs, and all these other sort of schools that are sort of, they have like these humanist philosophies about being good to others and all these other things. So like what I'm just trying to do is map out the different options that you have logically. And then obviously as a Muslim, if you're going to put your child into a school, actually it's not obvious, because from the Instagram results that I'm getting, I can see there's a few people that are actually open to the idea of sending children to independent non-Muslim schools. And that was a real awakening to me, because I've always assumed that if you're going to pay the fees, you might as well send them to a Muslim school. But there's some Christian schools and some other schools that people were mentioning, and I'll maybe touch upon that if we've got time at the end. But the point is that out of the 10,000 schools in Australia, you need to first determine, as the second dot point says, am I going to send my child to a private school or a government school or homeschooling? So I think the first breakdown would be homeschooling versus normal schooling. And I guess the idea there is that there's pros and cons of everything. And if people like, what a lot of people realize is that if you're like very zealous about this topic of like how the fact that schools are sort of influencing children and all these other things, and you want to sort of go down that homeschooling route so you can insulate your child, or you could possibly accelerate them, or you could possibly get them to memorize Quran during the mornings and then do schooling in the evenings. There's like many different arguments for homeschooling that I've heard. I think that the really human side of it is like when you actually have children and you realize how much time and dedication they need, and the fact that you need your own time and you need to sort of send them to a daycare or something like that away from yourself so that you can sort of focus on your own existence. You come to the realization that homeschooling will be very, very difficult. It will have a huge burden on your marriage, and it's a very resource-intensive thing. Now, there's a new secondary market within homeschooling, which is like these institutions that are sort of formed to help parents outsource homeschooling, which I found counterintuitive, because you're escaping the schooling system because you want to homeschool them, but then you're sending them to some shack or some little house or something where they are doing homeschooling with other people. And I thought that if you're going to send them somewhere and you're going to pay these exorbitant fees, you might as well send them to an independent school. But hey, I'm a bit crazy. Like, I for some reason, I'm not sure why it hasn't dawned upon people that these other institutions that are helping people do homeschooling inevitably are sort of circumventing some of the benefits of homeschooling. There's another model of homeschooling, which I've sort of seen some people do, which is obviously they'll memorize the Quran in the morning and do some knowledge and all this other stuff. And then in the evenings, what they do is they have private tutors. So someone will come to their house, or they're doing something online, and they help them smash through the curriculum and cover all the syllabus points and all these other things. So that's another point of homeschooling. But I think it really depends on the age of the child. It depends on what resources you have. It depends on the opportunity cost. So is it better for the parent who is doing the homeschooling to do something else, like business or work or all these other things? So though you're not paying fees per se, the fact that you're foregoing a 60 or 100 grand salary because that parent is having to stay back, that would be the fee, if that makes sense from that perspective. So there's many other things, but I think like my personal philosophy is like Adam Smith and stuff. Capitalism basically breeds specialization of skill sets. The school is established because it's a place specialized with people that have been studying this thing at university, pedagogies and all these other things, so that learning is more effective. So why would I, Joe Blow, who knows nothing about teaching kids, why would I try to teach my own kids? when I can get someone who specializes in those particular subject areas, etc., to basically educate my kids. It'd be the same thing, like, why don't I bake my own bread? Yes, bread has many artificial preservatives and all these other things. Obviously, there's some alternatives. But the idea here is that the reason I don't do that is because it's more cost effective and time effective for me to just go to the shop, pick up a bag of bread and just buy it. So specialization of labor exists all around us. We outsource many functions of life, and I think schooling is one of those things that personally, at least, I've come to the conclusion that I will outsource in my life. I would not go down the route of homeschooling. That's not to say that homeschooling can't work for some people, and it can work, provided there's other things. But that's sort of my view on homeschooling. Now we've sort of entered the realm of schools. The question then becomes about, okay, do I send them to a private school or a public school? And I will sort of display some data in terms of arguments for and against. Like, I think what I've come to the realization of increasingly is that government schools are not the same government schools that perhaps you and I sort of grew up in. I'll show you what school I went to in a second and how it performs relatively. But the idea here is that I was speaking to someone who was a really big advocate of sending Muslim kids to public schools or government schools. And recently, when their own children have sort of started going into high school and like this stuff around LGBT and all these other topics have raised their head, they found themselves in a very awkward situation. The kid is sort of ostracized. Your children might be ostracized because they're not partaking in a particular purple color day or something like that. They're sort of seen as transphobic, or they're seen as cisgender, etc. So the idea here is that even in like heartland suburbs where there's a lot of Muslims, this idea of particular concepts that are counter to Islam are being pushed. And I don't think it's like LGBT is like the red line. Like, there's many things like a materialistic worldview, atheist ontology, all these other things sort of have been pushed upon kids from before. I think now is just becoming a bit more apparent, and I think the LGBT topic for a lot of parents is a very sensitive topic. And so I think that's why there's sort of a lot of parents are sort of switching from the idea of sending kids to government schools to now sending them to Islamic schools. And I think for me, like, that is a core driver of me shifting in my own view as well. But government schools obviously are not one big cluster as well. So government schools, you have obviously depending on the background of the suburb that you're in, and I'll show a quick example in a second. You can go to a government school that does quite well. Government schools are also some that are partially selective or completely selective, and so it's not just about the closest school that you live to, so it could also be based off merit. Government schools also have things like OC, so opportunity classes that students that are academically gifted can actually partake in. So there's many things that government schools have working for them if you want to go down that route. Like, if you look at the top 10 schools in New South Wales based off the recent HSC results, only 4 of them are independent schools, 6 of them are government schools. Now, obviously, those 6 schools are like selective completely, if I recall correctly. But the idea here is that there are government schools that are better than other government schools. So it's important not to sort of pull them all together. Then you come to private schools. So then you've got sort of like this trade-off between, do you send them to an Islamic school or a non-Islamic school? And here I'll just quickly explain my methodology, which is I've only looked at what I consider Muslimic schools. So what I'm talking about here is that I'm not talking about non-Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah groups. So for example, I'm not talking about the Zahra school out in Arncliffe. I'm not talking about the Habashi school, Salama College in Sefton. I've excluded those schools because obviously they don't follow the same belief systems that most Sunnis do. So I'm only looking at mainstream Sunni schools that are based in Sydney. Then what I'm also doing is I'm looking at what I call Muslimic schools. So there's some schools that are independent schools, and inherently the philosophy aligns a lot with Islam, but for whatever reason the school has adopted a marketing or branding position where they don't market themselves as Islamic schools, and this is also happening in Melbourne. So for example, Alpha Omega, Amity College, these are schools that are independent schools. Vast majority, if not all students or close to all students, are Muslim. Many of the teachers are Muslim. A lot of the philosophy, a lot of the prayer facilities, a lot of all those other things are normal, just as you'd have in a Muslim school. but they don't market themselves as a Muslim school. There's another reason that I use the word Muslimic schools to define these schools, is because when you speak to many parents, these schools are not necessarily Islamic. So these schools are schools that have, yes, many Muslims there, they may pray, etc. But the Islamic component of it, so what it differentiates it from another school might be, for example, is in extents. So some schools might have a uniform policy that enforces covering the hair for girls that have passed the age of puberty, or other things. Some of these schools are Islamic from the perspective that they provide prayer facilities or Friday prayers. Some of them will provide Islamic lessons or part of the curriculum. But the thing is, like, the growing consensus that I get is there's no proper Islamic school. There's no Islamic school where kids are really taught Quran, Arabic language as a priority. Many a times it's that the academic part is the most important thing, because obviously parents want the ATA results at the end of each year and the school ranking. So therefore the schools are sort of like adapting for that market by putting less emphasis on Islamic well-being, mannerisms and all these other things. So you might just sort of walk into two buildings, one's an Islamic school and one's a non-Islamic school. Besides the uniform and some facilities to pray and stuff, there's not that much of a difference from that perspective. So that's why I call them Islamic schools, because yes, there's some hints of Islam, but mainly you're sending your kids there because it's all other Muslim kids. And like that's one of the examples of a qualitative thing that I can't judge. I can't judge that this school is more Islamic than another school. So I haven't put that into my criteria. The other aspect that I'd sort of quickly touch upon is that, like, there's some shocking stories that I've heard from Islamic schools of behavior and things that have happened that are completely unacceptable by any measure of Islam. Like, for example, I heard recently a very prominent Muslim school here in Sydney was teaching children the Quran through transliteration. So instead of teaching the kids the letters of the Arabic alphabet and then the vowels and then the tajweed and the rest of it, whoever like was put in charge of the Islamic curriculum was like, just sack that. The kids already know how to read English. Let's just teach through transliteration. So instead of learning Bismillah with the ba and the rest of it, they're learning it with B, I, S, M, etc. And it's sort of like, why are parents paying your school to be Islamic school and sending the kids there with the hope that you're going to teach them Quran and the basics, etc., whilst you're like failing in that regard? So there's some shocking stories that you hear, and you sort of have to be very cautious of that. So like personally, like if I was to send my children to an Islamic school, I wouldn't have this expectation that they're going to learn Islam at these schools. And I think if you walk in with your eyes open and your expectations set, then you won't be disappointed. If your child finishes from primary school and doesn't know Juz Amma by heart, that's on you. And that's why I think it's very important to realize that you're sending them for a particular objective. And as for the Islamic tarbiyah and all that other stuff that you should be doing at home, or sending them to a Quran school or something like that, or a Saturday school, you have to be doing that on the side, etc. The other issue with some of the things that with the analysis is that some schools have changed names. So for example, Iqra College that used to be in Campbelltown is now Al Faisal College. Green Valley Islamic School is now Minara College. So there's like some name changes, and there's also some issues around campuses. So in some instances, the data is available for the school across all campuses as one sort of aggregate or macro result, and in some instances, it's at a campus level. So what I've done here is I've used a few different resources. I've sort of just slapped on, like I made this deck in a hurry. I've slapped on all the logos of the different places. But what's the main thing is, like, there's a website called My School. So if you go onto myschool.edu.au, basically it incorporates all of these things. So the Australian curriculum, ACARA, and also like NAPLAN. So there's all these other things as well. But what's interesting is that the school, that particular website, what it's done is it's used, it collects all the data, and then it's also used Deloitte, and more recently in the last two reports from I think 2019 onwards, they've been using PwC. So obviously these are from the big four consulting firms to basically help them out when it comes to financial reporting about schools and the rest of it. And there's very detailed reports that go into that. I've also used a few articles from the Sydney Morning Herald, and I've also used a myriad of different sources to validate parent feedback of schools. So I've looked at social media channels, star reviews, ratings, feedback in comments and in reviews, and on Google listings as well. So I've tried to aggregate as much information there as I could. The Ed Arabia is like a website that has about 1,000 schools on there, and this is appealing to like an international market. So people from other seas that are overseas that are looking at sending their kids to schools here in Australia, this is a website that sort of aggregates them and also compares them, and that also has reviews from international students. Okay, so without a further ado, I sort of get into the actual comparison. So what I've done here is I'm going to talk about like articles from the Sydney Morning Herald that I think are very, very important. And then actually before that, what I will do is I just want to escape to just give like a quick background in terms of methodology and where I'm getting data from. So this is the government website, the My School website. And then like this is an example of how like PwC is involved in sort of the reporting. So it's like very legit. So I'll close that. And they've got guides in terms of understanding what some of the metrics are. So for example, the ICSEA thing that looks at like social, like educational advantage. This is a very important metric because when they're comparing schools, they're not just comparing schools like for like, they'll say schools with a similar background. So it's sort of like if you're a privileged school in the eastern suburbs, then you should be compared to privileged schools in the eastern suburbs, not like schools in remote areas that have very high, social economic issues / low education, etc. So like what the point is that you're sort of doing a like for like comparison, but you can also move away from that confound to sort of look at schools at an absolute level. And I'll show you how I've done that as well. So what I've done here is I just want to give a quick example. So what you will do is like you'll type in a suburb or a school, and you can choose whether it's a government or non-government school, whether it's a private secondary combined. So combined is secondary and primary, or a special school. So that's for children with special needs, and you can choose the state. So here are some examples, just quickly. This is the school that I went to. So I don't know why a lot of people think I went to Malik Fahad, but I went to Canterbury Boys High School. Graduated in 2012, and like I wouldn't recommend it. Like the reason I haven't gone back there to sort of give like a speech or something like that about encouraging kids or something like that is because I can't help but say I'll be forced to say go to a better school. Now obviously like you end up at a school due to various reasons, etc. And I don't hold my parents in any other light than respect. Obviously as migrants, this data stuff wasn't available, so they just sort of asked their friend circle, and they're like, okay, my son's going to this school, my brother ended up going to this school, I ended up going to this school. So for most people, that's how it works. It's not like a really logically thought out process. But obviously now that we have this data available, and we're sort of more equipped with sort of researching and all these other things, this is important. So like off the bat, you can tell this is like a crummy school. When you look at the ICEA results or the CEA results, so this is looking at things like your parents' education level. This is looking at things like social economic class, a myriad of things. And what it's giving you is a score. And that score is out of 1,000. So the average score would be 1,000. And what that would look like is 25, 25, 25, 25 across all quadrants. When you have a disbalance where people are more towards the bottom, then you have a score that's under 1,000. And if you have, obviously the opposite of it, if you have more students in the top quadrants, then you have a score over 1,000. And then like the other idea here is that you get a percentile. So out of 100, where do you sit? You also get all this information, but what I'm going to do is just quickly skim through. So like you can go to your NAPLAN results. And yes, this thing just keeps coming up. Okay, let me just quickly go back. So this is a live example. So I typed in the word Canterbury. It will show me all the schools that have the word Canterbury. Go to Canterbury Boys, and then I can go to NAPLAN results, and then I can see, for example, what's been happening. And when I'm comparing Canterbury Boys, despite its low SES background, to other schools that have low SES backgrounds, you can see that it's struggling, especially Year 7 here. So it's well below average, as you can see here. That red mark is a bad thing. And then you can sort of go back historically. So I'm not sure if they go back to when I was at school. No, they don't. So I can't check that. But I've already looked at this. I think 2020 they skipped because of COVID and stuff. But you can then compare it to all Australians. So you're like, okay, I don't want to compare myself to people that are like me. I want to just compare myself to everyone. And in that situation, obviously it gets worse, because if you're a school that is getting compared to lower schools, and then you get compared to the average, you see these things. So I think they need to focus on grammar and some other things. You can see then like particular grades and subjects. So NAPLAN has obviously 5 areas: reading, writing, spelling, grammar, and numeracy. And then you can sort of see where they sort of stack. So you can see the score is below the line for Year 7 reading. And then you can obviously change it. So you can go, okay, let's look at Year 9. And you can sort of see where they sit, and you can see that they're sort of sitting below the average again. So this is a pretty cool website, and a lot of people don't know that this data exists, similar to like when I talk about charities and the fact that all their reporting is publicly available. A lot of people don't believe me, but then when I show them, they sort of come to realizing there's a lot of things. Then you can sort of look at some things around attendance. Another key aspect is finance. So for example, this school charges only $122. Obviously there's voluntary contributions and all these other things, but per student, the state government is giving them $18,000, and the federal government is giving them $5,000. So per student, the school is grossing $23,000, and this is on average. So this is important because when I'm going to be talking about Islamic schools and the fee structures that they have, naturally the schools have sibling discounts and early payment discounts potentially, and they have higher fees for the higher the grade. So Year 12 isn't going to be charged the same fee as say Year 3. So it's important to realize that we're talking about averages here. But because we're using the same methodology and the same data source for all of them, you can sort of make a meaningful comparison that's trajectories or like based off relative judgment. So yeah, that's important. So anyways, you can sort of basically get a sort of idea of the school from there. So again, this was the school that I went to. I wouldn't recommend it. I wouldn't be sending my kids here. And let's compare that to something else. So here I've got, just to be sort of funny, I guess, one of the brothers I was sort of talking to wants to send his kids to this school. So Sydney Grammar School in Darlinghurst. And look at theirs. So they're in the 99th percentile. So I was actually looking, there's no school that gets 100 percentile because there's so many that sit on 99. So I'll show you that in a second. But look at this by comparison. Like 99 percentile, there's like no kids in like the bottom half of society going to this school. It's either you're in the top echelons or like the top middle class. And you can also see how many of them speak English, etc. But I'll jump quickly to the finances. And the parents there on average are paying 40 grand. And this is a school that starts from kindergarten and goes all the way to Year 12. So that's 13 years. So obviously we're playing with averages here, because like arguably the investment you make into your child is the biggest investment. And I think this is true. I think the fact that you spend time learning about which school you're going to send them to, etc., is a sign that you're sort of researching, similar to like how you'll sit here and look at stocks and compare them and their net present values and the earnings per share and all these other things. You should be doing this for schools, because your child is your biggest investment. From an Islamic perspective, obviously they will hold your legacy and your good deeds will continue through them as one of the 3 avenues. And then obviously from a worldly perspective, you want your child to do well. So let's just say 40 grand over 13 years, that's about 520,000. So that's $500,000 that parents are willing to fork out for their kids, assuming they go from kindergarten to Year 12. $500,000 of an investment just in fees. And obviously with inflation and school fees going higher, that would go higher. So what I'm trying to say is that I was reading articles about how people are spending hundreds of thousands of dollars just on one child. And I assume you have two children, like many people will have. That's $1 million in school fees over the 12 years if you're sending them to this particular school. And then obviously you've got your fees, and then on top of that you've got like excursions and all these other things like uniform. So if you're going to one of these schools where you wear straw hats and you ride a pony and you play the violin, you add all those additional costs and like it balloons out quite fast. So it's no wonder that when you look at the NAPLAN results, what do you expect? Obviously, like they're well above in every regard. That's if you compare them to people on a 99 percentile. So when you compare them to all of Australia, they're flying far ahead. So let me just show you this. Like, look at that gap. Look at that gap in just Year 3 reading between the normal Australian person and where these children are at. So like you get what you pay for. But then like I was speaking to another brother who wants to send his child to this school, Kent Road. So the Eastwood, the case study I was referring to earlier in my presentation tonight. So look at that. That's not bad. And this is a government school. That's pretty good. That in the 94th percentile, based off socioeconomic class, and this is a public school. So look at how much you pay in fees. You only pay $215 on average. So again, compare that to 40 grand, Sydney Grammar, to $200. And if you look at the NAPLAN results, it's pretty amazing. Look at that, well above on everything. And let's look at the margin, that similar margin. So what I'm trying to say here is that like you can sit down and crack open an Excel sheet and basically go through this data and compare schools. How much do they cost? Like if you're more price sensitive, how much do they cost? What's the best yielding thing? But as you can see with these examples that I've shown you, you can have a government school that's excelling, like something like Kent Road. You can have a government school that's completely terrible, like the school that I went to. Or you can go to a private school and get good results as well. And you can also go to a private school that has bad results. And I'll show you this stuff in a second. But back to the presentation, what I wanted to do, the reason I just wanted to do that detour is just to sort of show like where I'm getting my data from. So it's legit data, I'm not just like making it up. And so now what I want to do is move over to like some articles that are in the Sydney Morning Herald that sort of paint a picture in terms of how schools compare. So I've linked them all down the bottom. These are not the prettiest slides I've ever made. I just clobbered them together in like half an hour, so forgive me for that. But what I'm going to show you is a side by side. So on the left hand side, we have public schools that are in the top 150 schools in New South. Yes, I think in New South Wales, if I remember correctly. And on the right hand side, you have the top 100, the schools that are in the top 150 from private schools. So you'll see what I've done here is I've only shown you the schools that are in the top 30. So that what the graph is doing, and I'll use transitions to sort of move further along. But the dark blue circles that you can see are schools that are ranked in the top 30. And then if I move through, it will change color. So the light blue is the schools that are ranked between 30 and 60. And then yellow schools are between 60 and 90. And then this sort of like pinkish color is between 90 and 120, and then the last 30 are the dark brown colors. Now, what I want to quickly do, the reason I've sort of presented it like this, is look back at where the Muslims are located. So if you recall, like in the 10-year plan, when I was talking about where there's a sort of like a ring fence of people that are within, that have suburbs that have at least 10% of their population identifying as Muslims, according to the ABS statistics that were taken last year, you'll remember that it's basically this area here. So the western half of the Canterbury Bankstown LGA, and then you've got a lot of it in the Cumberland LGA. So if you can see my mouse here, it's these two boxes here. Or on the right hand side, it's these two boxes. So in the top 30, you only have a select group of schools in here. And it's very, it sort of cements that point that I've been trying to make, that the LGAs where Muslims live, there's not that many high-ranking schools. So in the top 30 schools, we only have in the Al-Nouri that's coming. If we look at the sort of Bankstown Canterbury LGA, Canterbury Bankstown LGA, you have Al-Nouri, which is currently ranked 26th in the system. And then you've got these other two schools down here in the private school sector, and that is Alpha Omega and Al Faisal College. Obviously, they're like a stone throw apart in Auburn. So that's the Auburn sort of cluster of where Muslims live. And then, like, if you go out to the public school, the only public school between these two LGAs that ranks in the top 30 is Girraween, which is 29th. So this one here. So you can see very clearly that there's like, if you compare it to the other LGA, so remember how I was talking about how I looked at articles where the people said, where's the best place to raise kids and stuff? If you look at the eastern suburbs by comparison, there's like a smattering of so many of these schools. So obviously you've got Sydney boys and Sydney girls, and you've got North Sydney girls and North Sydney boys from the private school sphere. For the public schools. So those two dots there and those two dots are Sydney boys, Sydney girls, North Sydney boys, North Sydney girls. And again, that's pointing out the fact that we've got like these selective schools. And this is obviously Balcombe Hills, which is also, I think, completely selective. So the point that I'm trying to reinforce is the fact that ceteris paribus, everything being equal, the locations where Muslims live are sort of under sort of represented when it comes to top schools in the system. And then obviously when you go to the top 60, you can see that the same thing occurs. Most of them are private schools, and a lot of them are sort of on that eastern side of the Red Rooster line. So if you recall, I talked about how Sydney is split into two. The eastern half, that basically a line that breaks down this way, most of the schools are here. And then if you go into the top 90, again, that Red Rooster line holds on the right-hand side. The private schools here in this corridor here, east of the Red Rooster line, are doing significantly better. And then once you get to like the top 120, that's when you start seeing a bit more of a spread. So that's where you sort of see the first and only public school in the Canterbury Bankstown LGA that ranks in the top 150, and that is the school here, that is Sefton High School. And I think that's partially selective, if I recall correctly. And then you also see Amity College. So Amity College is the one just here. Sorry, on the wrong screen. This one here appear as well. And then if you look at the 150, then obviously it's spread out. So what I'm trying to say is, like, when you're looking at the first 190, you see like that Red Rooster line hold. And if you look at all of them, you'll start noticing that Red Rooster line, most of the schools into the top 150 are east of that line. So that's why obviously property prices, a lot of articles talking about it's better to raise your kids there, etc. So that sort of obviously holds. So I just wanted to point that out at a macro, because previously, leading into the school discussion, we've been talking about geography and how Sydney is situated. So it makes sense to start off by visualizing the data that way. So this is from Sydney Morning Herald. You can access this as well. Then there's a question, like, remember how we're talking about should you send your kid to an independent school or a government school or a selective school, etc. Look at that, like in the top 150, consistently for about the last 8 years, and I'm assuming if you go further back historically, independent schools have basically outdone government schools. So when you're looking at government schools, you're looking at the selective one, so that's the red line. So arguably they do a bit better, slightly better. And then you've got all the government schools, and then you've got the Catholic schooling system. So basically you have the three systems: the independent, a government, and Catholic. And then government basically depends on whether you go to a selective school, you'll be better than Catholic. If you go to a normal government schools, you'll probably do worse than Catholic school system on average. So again, like when I'm making those statements, I'm saying at a macro level. You're obviously going to have some selective schools like James Roos are going to come first, and they're a government school. But the idea here is that if you're looking at a macro level, this is how it stacks up. And then there's another interesting thing, which is like the gendered view. Assuming that you believe in gender binaries where people are either boys or girls when they're children, you see that there's a relationship in some instances, not too significant in most instances, of how going to a particular school improves your chances or not. So you can see, for example, and by success rate, we're talking about, as I said, band 6 in the HSC subjects that you sat. So you see girls do the best when they go to a fully selective school, and they do the worst when they go to a partly selective school, which is interesting. And boys obviously do best when they go to a fully selective school, and they do worse when they're just at a government school, a non-selective government school, and that makes sense. Go to an all-boys school that's a government school that's not selective, and you'll see the behavior and all these other things, and you just come to. So that's where I guess. So it's interesting as well to look at that. But as you can see, sending your child to an independent or a fully selective school is much better than the overall average. And that's what this picture is pointing. That's what this graph is visualizing. And that holds whether it's a boy or a girl. Okay, along the lines of gender as well, again, these are all from Sydney Morning Herald, that boys dominate particular subjects and girls dominate other subjects. So I'm just going to talk about boys for a second. And it's interesting because, like, despite all the political correctness and the incentives for women to become engineers and all this other stuff, you just don't see that happening. And like, people used to think it was like a sociological reason, like the toys that kids are given at younger ages and all this other stuff. But you just see it hold, like it just holds through time, it holds through place, that boys excel at things that are more logical, more mathematical, more spatial orientation. And you do like these IQ tests, like when we were studying psychology, third year independent individual differences, you can see IQ being different between genders very clearly from a very young age all the way to adulthood. There's differences, and I think the HSC is a great, like, another nail in the coffin of those people that try to equalize these things. So you see, for example, engineering, construction, software design, physics, IT, mathematics, extension 2 and extension 1, etc., or like even mathematics advanced. These are all dominated by boys. That doesn't mean that girls can't do well or girls should be discouraged from these subjects. But what I'm just trying to say here is that if you're thinking of putting your child into a gender-specific school or their subject selections, then these are naturally the things that people are accustomed to doing better in if they're a boy or a male, sorry. Which same thing, I guess. But anyways, then you've got females, and they do better at things like dance, textile, family studies, food technology, and languages. Like if you look at, and this is something that holds in psychological studies as well, on IQ tests. So you can see that there's like gender differences, and they're significant. Like no one's complaining about the fact that females overrepresent high achievers when it comes to dance. Only 2% of boys are getting band sixes compared to female counterparts when it comes to dance. No one's complaining about that because it doesn't seem to be an issue. And that's obviously highlighting the fact that these are very political, ideologically driven arguments when people are talking about underrepresentation in particular things. So anyways, I'll park my sort of political views for a second, but I just wanted to point this graph out. So if you're selecting subjects for your child or helping them select their subjects or guiding them on particular things, it makes sense for them to do things that come naturally to them. And so for females, it makes sense for them to do particular subjects, and for males, it makes sense for them to do particular subjects. Anyways, moving right along. When we look at the 150 schools as well, this graph is looking at the success rates in relationship to the fees that they charge. So remember, I gave the example of Sydney Grammar and the fact that they charge on average about 40 grand per year. You can see Sydney Grammar here. One of the reasons I use that as well is you can see Sydney Grammar stacking up here, this green dot here with the name Sydney Grammar. Sorry if it's a bit small on your screen. But you can see that the independent schools, again, obviously because they're about like, how many were they? They're like 80% of all the schools here. That's why they're all green dots. You do have 2 red dots, which are international schools. So these are schools that have like campuses elsewhere, etc. But the idea here is that you can see the Catholic school as well, schooling system here. But the idea that I'm trying to show is that when you look at private schools and how much fees they charge, it doesn't necessarily mean that the more you pay, the higher the success rate. And this is a very, very important thing. When you're paying a school higher fees, what are those fees going towards? And I'll show you with the Muslim instance, I think there is a relationship between the fees that you get in some schools and what you actually get back. And I'll show that in a second. But you can see, for example, that Al-Nouri, the Al-Nouri Muslim school here, which is highlighted here on the left-hand side, is getting a success rate of, say, mid-30s, according to this graph here. And you've got schools that are charging 8 times that here on the right-hand side. So if you just draw a line right to the right, they're getting the exact same mark, if not less. So you can see if you draw a line to the right, many of these schools are getting less than Al-Nouri, but they are charging way more. In some instances, 8 times more or 10 times more, and yet they're getting the same results. So like what I'm trying to say is that yes, there is a relationship between paying more and getting results, but it isn't a fixed relationship. It isn't a one-to-one. $1 more you get, 1 more mark you get. It doesn't work like that. So that's very important as well as a consideration when looking at schools. This graph then is looking at the same 150 schools and then comparing them based off their privilege score. So remember how I said that there's an SES background or the ICSEA score, and then there's in percentiles. You can see that the schools that have, many of them that have the 99 percentile are naturally appearing in the top schools. And then you can also see that there's some schools that surprisingly, despite having a very low socioeconomic background, like Mary MacKillop College, they're still ranking well and having success rates that are like above the average. So the success rate across all schools is 4%. And I'll show that in a table shortly when we compare all the schools. But the idea here is that, again, there is a stronger correlation between the privilege that you have and your marks. So look, like what I'm trying to say is if you look at the graph on the left-hand side, you can see it's more dispersed. So yes, there is like arguably a positive correlation. So the more that one thing goes up, the other thing goes up. So you can see like a line that's slight. If you were to put a trend line or something like that, you would sort of see it rising to the right-hand side. But it's less evident. Whereas if you look at here, you can see a very clear line that the more privileged you are, the more educated your parents are, the more income your parents are earning, the better the suburb that you're living in, the better the educational outcomes, the success rate for students. So that's more correlated than the fees that you pay. And that's an interesting point. I gave the example of the Kent Road Public School. They're paying $200 a year. It's a public school, government school, but it's got a 94 percentile privilege score because all the parents are like highly educated, largely Chinese background according to the ABS statistics, and they're just killing it despite going to a public school. So there's like a lot of variables to take into consideration. Okay, I think this is one of the last articles I'll go into before I start talking specifically about the Muslim schools. Another sort of constraint on this is the IB, so the International Baccalaureate, or I think that's how you pronounce that. The IB basically is an alternative to the HSC. So most students, so every year I think there's about, I think if I recall correctly, between 50 and 70,000 students that sit the HSC. Like exams that are sat for the HSC. And then what happens is that you are given a ATAR, and that ATAR is increments of 0.05. I think the lowest ATAR is 30, if I'm not mistaken. I think if you get below 30, you get like a mystery mark. But basically the highest is 99.95. No one gets 100. So in New South Wales, like only 48 students out of 50,000, out of a cohort of 50,000 get 99.95 for the people that sit the HSC. The IB is a completely different system of judging your academic ability, and UAC, or the sort of a government body that takes into consideration which universities that you are paired up with based off your ATAR results and bonus points and the rest of it, they also get the IB results, and then they sort of mark it onto an ATAR. So the like if you look at it, 600 students sit the IB and 41 of them get a 99.95. So you've got 41 and 48, but the difference is that in the 41 there's only 600 students, and in the 48 for the HSC there's 50,000 students. So there's like this two-tier system that was occurring. So this was an article that was written again in Sydney Morning Herald at the beginning of this year, or I think at the end of the year, last year. And then like literally a few days later, UAC announced that they're actually changing it. So basically what used to happen is the IB, if you got a 45, it would scale to a 99.95 ATAR. Now what they've done is they've taken the IB to decimal points. So I think to get a 99.95, you need to get something like a 45.75 or a 45.5 IB score to get a 99.95. If you just get a 45, previously you would have gotten a 99.95 ATAR, but now you're only going to get something like 99 point something else, or 98 or something like that. So it's important to realize that there's like this IB thing, because the relevance, yes, there are Muslim schools that do IB. So that's part of, I was going to mention that literally as the next point. There are Muslim schools that do IB, and that's why you can't compare something like AIA to a Nouri. They're doing two different ways of getting ATAR scores. So IB schools, they don't get ranked. So you won't see something like MLC or PLC, like Pimble Ladies College. They will have like dozens of kids that get 99.95 ATAR equivalent because of the IB, but they don't get ranked in the 150. So like the 150 ranking thing that the Sydney Morning Herald publishes and all these other places publish is just based off the success percentage, the number of students that get a band 6 or a E4, I think, in an extension unit. So they're not looking at people that are not doing HSC subjects or HSC exams, and that excludes all these kids that are doing the IB. Granted, there's only about 600 of them, but it's an interesting point to note as well. Anyways, now let's get into comparing Islamic schools. Okay, now this is the juicy part of tonight's presentation. As I said, please don't be offended by any of the results that you see. This is just data being represented in graphs. So the first thing I looked at was the NAPLAN results. So on the right-hand side, you can see all the schools' names, and then you can see how they've ranked. Now, this is important. I'm comparing by grades here. So by grades, I mean that NAPLAN, the first year that you sit it is in year 3, and then you sit it every 2 years, and the last one is in year 9. So there's 4 NAPLAN results that you will sit. And then this is looking at the last data that's available. I think it's 2021 results, if not 2022. But you can see all the schools and where they sit. So naturally, there's like, I think the scoring increases. So you can see all the schools are improving, with the exception of Arcana College. At the moment, the year 3 did so well that year 5 results are not as good. But you can see here that there's some schools that are, there's like a big spread of schools. So Okay, let me just explain one quick thing. If you look at Arcana, for example, this orange line, that's Arcana College. The reason that it doesn't go into year 7 and year 9 is obviously it's a primary school. And you'll sometimes see a line, so like for example, if you look at Alpha Omega, this blue line that's very hard to see, it only appears for year 7 and year 9 because they don't do primary school. So the data is only representing or reflecting what subjects or what grades are sat for that particular school. Okay, so that's by grade. So you can see that if you're looking at by grade, you can see Al Faisal College, Campbelltown, which is this pink line here at the top. And you can see Al Nouri, which is this light blue, and Al Faisal College, which is this other shade of blue. These three schools are basically coming first across those four grades because they go from K to 12. The only exception is where Arcana comes second in year 3, and then obviously it drops down, but you can see that that's the case. Now, that's by grades. Now, this second graph here on the right-hand side is looking at it by subject area. So remember I said NAPLAN, it comprises of 5 areas: reading, writing, spelling, grammar, and numeracy. So you can see here, again, the same 3 schools. So in order, you see Al Faisal College, Campbelltown. In all subject areas except reading, they are coming first. And they're coming second to Al Nouri, who comes first when it comes to reading. And then you can see that it's a back and forth between Al Nouri and Al Faisal College Auburn campus when it comes to subject areas. And then you've got like a big gap, and then all the other schools come behind that. So this is like an important consideration, I guess. If you're looking at the academics of a school, NAPLAN is one measurement of that. So like I sort of mentioned, I've put this purple line here, the dotted line, and you can see that there's a decent line or gap between the 3 horses that are winning the race in all subject areas, in all grades, and everyone else. So if you was to represent that in a table where you've got the gold medal in the middle and the silver on the left and the bronze on the right, you can see Al Faisal College is basically coming first literally in most things. Then second is Al Nouri, and then you can see Al Faisal College comes in, Al Faisal College Auburn campus comes in third. These 3 schools come first, second, and third in every metric, in every subject and every grade, with the exception of year 3. As I pointed out, Arcana College beats Al Nouri and Al Faisal Auburn. So that's 1/4, but basically first, second, and third in all grades and all subjects, other than that one exception, are between these 3 schools when it comes to NAPLAN. So I guess the idea here is that you're looking at NAPLAN as basically the pipeline of what's going to happen to the HSC rankings in the coming years. If this is weak, it shows that the cohorts that are coming through are weak, and naturally that will mean that the HSC rankings won't be sustained for some of these schools. But as you can see, these 3 schools are doing quite well. The other aspect of it would be the HSC rankings. So again, when we're talking about HSC rankings, we're talking about success percentage. So we're talking about kids that got band 6, what percentage of them. So on the James Roos obviously has been coming first like forever, and they typically get something like a 60+ % of success rate. So meaning of all the exams that all the kids sit, 60% of them are getting a band 6 in those exams. So that's a sort of important thing to consider as well. Now, when you look at these ranks, I went as far back as I could, and the furthest I could go was to 2009. So even when I was still in school. And back then, when I was in school, Malik Fahad was the best school. So like if we go back historically, Malik Fahad was so good that it was, I think, in like the top 10 or on the edge of the top 10. And that's something that none of the other schools have accomplished yet. So that was like when Muslims were like, wow, we're like in the top 10 schools. Obviously, since then, there's been a bit of a gap, and we've sort of inched our way back to the top 20s. But the idea here is that Malik Fahad used to be like the greatest school ever. Obviously, stuff happened. And when I'm saying greatest school ever, I'm obviously talking about from an academic perspective. I don't know about the social well-being and all the rest of it, but I'm just talking about it from that perspective. Then what happens is dramas happen or oris occur, and obviously, to the extent that in 2015, can you see how the yellow line is not joined? In 2015, Malik Fahad and Al Faisal College, they drop out of the 150. That's why the orange line for Al Faisal and the yellow line for Malik Fahad are broken here. which is interesting. Obviously, Malik Fahad makes a return in 2016, and then it sort of peters out, and then last year didn't make the 150, so it's going to be another broken line for them. Now, it's not until I finished from school in 2013 where 3 new schools sort of arrived in the top 150 range, and that is Al Faisal, Amity, and Alpha Omega. And you can sort of see that of the schools, Alpha Omega like dropped below the 50 and has relatively stayed in that area of like between like 70 and within the top 50, probably the most consistently, if we're going back from that period. Whereas Amity has also been very consistent. So Amity is this red line, though it's sort of gone up and down, but it's sustained itself. It's never fallen out of the 150, nor has it sort of cracked the 50. So that's just the thing with Amity, I guess. Al Faisal, obviously, as I mentioned before, dropped out of the 150 in 2015, but then it sort of made a huge resurgence, and now it's in that top 3. And then lastly, you can sort of see that you've got Al Nouri. So Al Nouri is like the most recent addition to the 150, but it's like it's on a really good trajectory. It's like cracking that. It's cracked the 20s, and I don't know, based off the NAPLAN results that I sort of covered previously, Al Nouri and Al Faisal are probably best positioned. Now, it's hard to judge with Alpha because it just has high school NAPLAN results, but I'd assume that they're doing well as well. So there's a 3-horse race. If you're looking at it from a campus perspective, if I go back to NAPLAN results, then you're looking at Al Faisal, Austral, or Auburn, or Al Nouri, if you're looking at academics for NAPLAN. Now, again, like I'm just saying that this is what the data is, and with the assumptions of that data that's being presented. As for standardized testing that looks at HSC results, then you're looking at a 3-horse race between Alpha Omega, Al Nouri, and Al Faisal. At the moment, Alpha's number 1, and then you've got Al Faisal, like I think is like 1 rank behind. That's like 25 and 26, or 26 and 27, and then you've got Al Nouri, which is like a couple of spaces behind them. So it's like a very concerted race from that HSC perspective. So that's like the rankings over the last 12 years or so, over the last dozen years. Okay, now this is like what I've been sort of building up to, and for the people that have stuck around, this is probably the thing that you want to screenshot. I'll make it publicly available as well. I'm going to hide my head so you can see all of it. And again, apologies, like probably watch this in like the highest resolution that you can. I don't know if it's 720 or what, 1080. Well, I'm definitely not filming in 4K. But this is it. Like if you wanted like on a 1-page what all the Muslim schools look like in Sydney, this would be it. And naturally there's a lot of data and there's a lot of schools, and so it has to obviously be presented in such a microscopic way. So get your magnifying glass out if you need to. But what I've done is, and this is what I wish if I had more time I'd break this down into more slides so it's more easy to consume in bite sizes. But what I've done is I've broken it down into about 6 or 7 areas. Like when you're a parent and you're looking to put your kid into a school, you're considering about these half a dozen considerations. Firstly is the admin and the logistics, and that's things to do with the location. So where it's actually, I'll go over the areas and then I'll go into the specifics of what makes up that vertical or that major column or umbrella. You've got the admin or the logistics of it. That's like, how am I going to get my kid into this school, and how am I going to take them to that school? Then you've got finances. How much is this going to cost? And what is the school doing with the money? Then you've got the well-being. Is my child going to like do okay? So you know how people talk about the academic side, and I've so far talked about the academic side of NAPLAN and HSC. There's a well-being component that's probably more important in many regards, in terms of like, does my child develop their personality? What's the personal development like? What's the Islamic culture like, etc. I've got a few metrics around that. Then you've got NAPLAN, HSC. So those are looking at the academics of it. And then you've got the reputation. So what I've done is, I forgot to put Zahra's Grammar School. I added that recently. I forgot to put the principal in there. So I've got the reputation, and that's based off 2 things, the principal or the executive principal if it's a multiple campus school, and then the average reviews, and I'll come to these metrics in a second. And then I've got other considerations. So I've looked at the SES background, how many of them speak English, and how many of them do vet courses, which I found not to be that important. Okay, then I've got the schools, and I've ranked the schools. So all the schools, let's go column by column. So I've got all the schools, those are the rows. I've colored Muslim Girls Grammar School in pink, because it's the only one that's a gendered school, so it's the only girls only school. But just a quick summary on them, you'll notice that there's not much data available. So that's why there's a lot of question marks around that, including things like fees and all the other stuff. But from other metrics, they're not doing too well. And I'll come to that in a second, why I think that's the case. Then I've got the median. So median, again, middle score. And I've got the average. So again, those are two different things. Refer to my other presentation that explains the difference between the two. And then I've got the all Australian student. So the median and the average is if I was to calculate all the schools, all the Muslim schools that I'm comparing, what would be the score? What would be the average score? What would be the middle score? And then where it's possible, I've included, and where it's publicly available, what's the Australian average for those particular things? For anyone watching, is the font too small? I know there's a time lag, so you'll probably respond by the time I finish the next sentence. So just going through this, so you've got the schools, and then I've got the suburbs. So where are the schools located? And again, this is a good example of where some schools have campus-specific data and some don't. So what I mean by that is Al Faisal College, for example, I've broken it down by the 3 campuses, so Auburn, Campbelltown, and Liverpool. But schools like, say, Malik Fahad, for example, that have multiple campuses, they only report the data as the one school. So take that obviously like into consideration when you're comparing schools that have multiple campuses. The same thing with Amity College. So Amity College obviously has multiple campuses. Oh, so the text is fine. Jazakallah khair, Riaz. So again, Amity College, Malik Fahad, for example, have multiple campuses, so you can't compare them. The numbers I've got publicly available are only at a macro level, whereas AIA and AIA and Al Faisal, I've got broken down by campuses. So anyways, that's the reason that the rows exist and the columns exist. Now let's go to the actual overlap between the rows and the columns. So firstly, we look at the administration logistics. And in a world where we still have to drive our kids, or the kids have to catch public transport to school, where you live and how far the distance is to the school is really, really important. So what I've done here is I've put the suburbs, and this obviously shapes the 10-year plan, because you want to live either very close to the school, if not in the same suburb as the school that you're sending your kids to, ideally. I put the range. So the range is between which grades does the school teach. So as I said, some of them go K to 12. Some of them are primary only. So the yellow ones are primary only. So Arcana, Al-Hikmah, Al-Ma'arif, and Zahra Grammar. So again, Zahra Grammar School is the one out towards Minto, which is a Sunni school. The other Zahra school, which is in Arncliffe, is a Shia school. So obviously I haven't included them in the list, as I haven't included Salama College, like I mentioned earlier in the presentation. The green ones are the K to 12. So I think there was one edit that I made of someone's advice. Basically, Al Faisal College is Campbelltown is K to 12. I think on the government website it said K to 11. So I've also patched that up. Some schools are then neither. So Risala College, for example, goes K to 9. Alpha Omega is high school, so it's blue. And another school that's neither here or there is Muslim Girls Grammar, which is Year 7 and Year 8. So it's not a primary school. It's not a a K to 12 school or a high school. It's just Year 7 and Year 8. And a lot of schools start off with a couple of grades and then they start adding on other grades. So maybe that school's going to go in the similar way. Then I've got enrollments. So the enrollments are how many students are in this school. So, and what I've done here, if you'll notice a pattern, is that the highest number I've colored with the cell in green, and the lowest I've colored in with the cell red. So the range is between Malik Fahad, which has 2,900 students, and Muslim Girls Grammar, which has 71 students. Now, obviously, if you were to combine some of the multi-campus schools, they would have higher numbers. So if I combined Al Faisal, so they would have basically what? They'll have close to 4,000 students, which would be the biggest school. Malik Fahad has 1,900 split between multiple campuses. So obviously, but like what I'm trying to say is from these numbers, Malik Fahad is the highest on paper, but net everyone knows Al Faisal was the biggest, with about 4,000 students across its 3 campuses. Then you've got the intake, and this is really, 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 really important. When you're a parent and you want to send your kid to an Islamic school or any school really, you need to realize that it's like daycare. There's many of these places are overbooked. There's a over demand and under supply, and therefore there's a waiting list. I'll give you a quick example. The school that's notoriously known for a very long waiting list is Arcana College. Arcana College is in Kingsgrove. It's a primary school, and they only have 210 students, and they have a waiting list. Last time I checked, from one of my friends who has been emailing them back and forth, they have a waiting list that's filled until about 2026. So the year just started, but for the next 3 years, the school is basically booked out. So I saw email exchanges where someone was basically trying to register their unborn baby at this school because to get onto the waiting list. And the school's like, no, the child has to be born before we can put them onto the waiting list. And I'm like, wow, it's come to that extent that like your wife gives birth. Instead of getting congratulations from your family and friends, the first thing you should do is email this particular school to get in. And it's interesting because it shows you how much parents actually want to go to this school. And I think it's generally speaking, it's a very good school. So yeah, 2026, it's booked out. So that boat sailed for my son at least, maybe for my daughter, I don't know. But what's interesting about this school is that part of their policies is like they have a sibling first policy. So for example, if your oldest child is in that school and you have another child, guaranteed a position will be made available for them. So like if you look at the intake column, so the intake column, I've put a little asterisk there because this is a calculation I'm doing. This isn't a number that the school's provided. I can obviously call up the school and ask them how many kids do you take every year and stuff. But I think that's a pointless question to ask and a waste of time. So what I've done instead is I've divided the number of students or enrollments by the number of grades that they have. So for example, if it's a K to 12 school, I've divided by 13 years. 12, obviously 1 to 12 and then plus kindergarten, 13 years. And then you sort of get a rough intake. And this is roughly. That's not to say that I know that, for example, Al-Nouri is increasing its intake every year because they've built more buildings recently. If you drive past, you'll know what I'm talking about. But the idea here is that some of these schools have very low intakes and that makes it hard. So for example, Arcana has an intake, my estimate is about 30 kids per year because I know that every grade is one class. They don't have multiple classes for year 2 or year 3. It's just one class, one grade. And therefore, obviously, if you've got, say, like roughly 20 or 30 positions and you have a sibling guaranteed policy, most parents are going to have multiple kids. So like maybe half of those positions will be gobbled up by kids that have older siblings at the school already. And really, you're only fighting for about 10 positions. And it's first in best dress. It's not even like you can pay more fees to sort of bribe your way into the school. Trust me, I know people that have tried. It's first in best dressed. And they don't even have the entry exam like Al-Nouri and some of the other schools have. So like when it comes to getting your kid enrolled at one of these schools, it's not that straightforward. And like what's another trend when I was sort of reviewing independent schools for my job at the software company was that there's a lot of data to suggest that a lot of people send their kids to a government school for public school because they don't think it's that important and like it's not that different, I guess, and there's no point paying extra. And then the philosophy is that you send your kid to a private school or an independent school when they're in high school. And a lot of parents do this. So what's interesting about that is that it's very hard to transition into an Islamic school. So I know someone, for example, they're sending their daughter to Malik Fahad and one of their son is going to Al-Nouri. And they want to move their daughter from Malik Fahad to Al-Nouri. And for the last 3 or 4 years, they've been paying all the fees to do the exams and administration enrollment process to make that transition from Malik Fahad to Al-Nouri. But basically, Al-Nouri will only open up a position if someone else leaves. And that's fair enough. I'm not making a moral judgment on the schools. I'm just trying to explain how the schools operate, more or less. If I'm running a school and I'm at full capacity because I've got a waiting list out the street, out the office door and out around the corner of hundreds of parents that want to get into my school, the only way that they can get into the school would be if another child leaves and goes to another school or whatever, and that position now becomes vacant. Now, if I've got hundreds of people sitting on a waiting list for that one vacant position, I have the bargaining power in determining who gets that position. So I can, if I was being capitalist about it, I can jack up the fee and just say, okay, whoever pays the most, I can auction it off, if you want to think about it from that capitalist perspective. Or what I can do is I can make these kids sit an exam and basically base it off academics, base it off merit. And that's what a lot of the schools will do. So, but what I'm trying to say is that once your kid is in, they're in. Like, I'll come to whether kids get kicked out and stuff in a second. But my point that I'm trying to make is that the best opportunity you have to get your child into an Islamic school or a Muslim school, more broadly speaking, is to get them in at kindergarten. Because that's when there's most vacancies open, because there's no class before it. So there's no kids transitioning into kindergarten. Those positions of various, like, I don't know, between my estimates, Al-Ma'arif has 20, the highest intake would be Malik Fahad with 223. And then obviously if you combine Al-Faisal campuses, it'd be about 300 or so. But that's why it obviously pays to go to, like, your chances are higher if you go to one of the bigger schools, but these bigger schools will still have these entry exams. So like, obviously it's like a question like, what the heck are you going to ask a child that's like in preschool about whether they can go to your school or not? And maybe I'll make a separate video on that. But a lot of it has to do with just like their social skills. Do they know how to count? Do they know their colors? Do they know Arabic? Have they memorized Surah Al-Fatiha and maybe Surah Al-Nas, etc.? So it's like basically like those questions for a 4-year-old. And what's interesting as well, and shapes as well, like when you should have kids in the calendar year, which quarter, if you plan it to that level, like I did, is that kids, like, because the exams and these interviews, etc., happen usually in the middle or the second half of the year, kids that are sort of, you know, the whole thing about whether you're born in after July or before July determines when you start school. There's like an advantage for some of the older children by about 6 months. And obviously, if you're 4 years old, 6 months is like what, 1/8 of your life. So 1/8 of your development ahead. So there's a little bit of bias towards kids that will be older when they sit the interview. And there's this whole argument, which I won't talk about right now, about should you hold your kids back, especially boys? Like, there's a view that if you have boys, it's better to hold them back a year. I think Australian government rules is that by the age of 6, every child has to be in school. But should you wait until then, or should you send your kids earlier? There's a whole debate about that as well. But my point is that getting your kids into an Islamic school isn't straightforward. If you think you're going to be rocking up on the last day, submitting an application form and getting in, you're going to be very surprised when your child doesn't get in. So it's better, like that's one of the things that I'm learning, that I'm trying to sort of put out there amongst young parents and Muslims, etc., that like naturally these schools are not going to do last minute applications. Like, get your kid in, do the process properly, be aware of the key dates, just like university. Like, you don't just hope to get in, you have to follow the process. Okay, so that's admin and logistics, where it is, the number of grades that they cater for, the number of enrollments that they have, and the number of kids that they take in. The next bucket of considerations is financial, and this is important. So you'll notice that with the fees, I've put like a red arrow there. It's in descending order. So the order in which the schools are being displayed in this table go from the most expensive, quote unquote, to the least expensive. So the range is between, on average, again, sibling discounts, etc., etc. Ignore that. Ignore the fact that when you're in year 12, it will be higher than when you're in year 7, because fees increase over years. The idea here is that the average fee for all the schools is being compared, and so worst case scenario is would have to come 3 years before. 3 years before, sorry, there's a time lag, so I'm not exactly sure what you're referring to. Like you basically want to start applying for Islamic schools as soon as possible, just like with daycare. Daycares usually have like a 6 month or like the one in Greenacre, Grow With Me, I think has like a 2-year waiting list. So you want to get onto these waiting lists as soon as possible, and like just avoid missing out. Now, when it comes to fees, finances, the range is between Alpha charging 5,200 on average, and Zahra Grammar in Minto charging 1,000. So you can see that there's like between the lowest and the highest, there's a factor of 5 being a differentiator. And as I said, like Sydney is very expensive to live in. Muslims may be struggling. On top of that, if you have multiple kids, this gets multiplied, and etc. And multiply over the years. So this can be like hundreds of thousands of dollars potentially. But the idea here is that I don't begrudge schools for charging extra money. if they sort of match it with the quality. Like if you pay peanuts, you get monkeys, like the saying says. So you sort of, the question is, are all these schools worth it at their price point? You know that YouTube thing where these guys compare food at 3 different price points? The question is, these are at different price points, but what do you get as a result of that? And that's what I'll come to in a second. But I'm just putting out the fact that Alpha is about 5,000, and then you've got the AIE, and then you've got Amity, Arcana, and they round up the schools that charge more than 4,000. And then there's a range that goes down. Then you've got the net revenue per student. So remember how I showed on the My School's website that the money that the school makes per student is a combination of how much fees they charge, the federal government's funding, and the state government's funding. So again, if we're looking at it from a net revenue per student, then Alpha is the highest. They're getting 23,000. So what that just means is about 18,000 is coming from government and 5,000 is coming from parents. And then the lowest is Australian Islamic College in Sydney. So this is in Mount Druitt, the school that's attached to the Rudy Hall Masjid. Per student, they're getting between parents and government 13,000. And like this idea of like appealing to government and getting more money, it also shows like an effort from the school's part and whatnot. So I think that schools that are smart will obviously appeal to government to get more and more money to basically invest back into the school. So when you look at it at a total revenue perspective, so this is if you took the total revenue from each of the students, multiplied it by the number of students, the total revenue, the highest is Malik Fahad on $42 million a year. Okay. And obviously if you combine the Al Faisal colleges, it would be more than that. So if you combine the Al Faisal colleges, it would be about $53 million between the 3 campuses. So you can see there's like about $40 or $50 million on one end that are getting put into schools, again, as a combination of fees, as a combination of government funding. But obviously the schools that have 2,000 plus kids will obviously get way more money. So there's that economies of scale that comes about as well. And then on the opposite hand, the lowest revenue school is Zahra Grammar, the one in Minto. Obviously they've got the lowest fees and they have a small number of students. So it's little wonder the fact that their total revenue is less than 2 million. Total net revenue is less than 2 million. And so again, like you're comparing very significantly different things. You're comparing schools with 40 or $50 million in net revenue with smaller schools that are making 2 million. So again, this is important because when you come to the final column in the finances, which is the accumulated capital expenditure, you come to realize that like the amount of money that the school can then put back into classrooms, science labs, equipment, etc., that they're significantly different as well. And this is where Deloitte and PwC come in, and they've got these reports on explaining what these metrics are and when you can count it. So for example, they differentiate between states as to whether you can count partially completed projects as a part of the accumulated capital expenditure. With New South Wales, which is what we're focusing on when I read the PwC report, they include anything that's partial. So for example, if the school started building a new gym or the school started to build a new building that's going to have classrooms, they can start putting that into their reporting as accumulated capital expenditure. So what's the range here? The range here is between Al Faisal Campus Auburn, which has capital expenditure that has been accumulated so far of about $30 million. So there's about $30 million that has been pumped into that campus in terms of its infrastructure. And on the opposite hand, you have something like, again, Zahra Grammar School. Again, I'm not picking on this school. It's just the smallest and has the lowest fee structure. So obviously it doesn't have the most money. I'm not making a value judgment here. I'm just making a quantitative judgment. So far on their school, they've spent about 90,000. So again, like you're comparing like a David and Goliath comparison here, like significant differences between the schools. And then again, like if you were to combine Al Faisal, the 3 campuses, the capital expenditure, again, at Auburn is 30 million, at Campbelltown is 1.5, and at Liverpool it's 20 million. So you're looking at something like, again, 50 million being invested across those 3 campuses. Whereas if you compare it to something like Malik Fahad, that also has multiple campuses, you only see something like 6.5 million. Okay, so that's finances. And again, like depending on your income and your family situation, you might choose a school based off fees and the fact that it's closest to you. So those would probably maybe be two important variables in that consideration. The third consideration would be well-being. So you don't want to just chuck your kid into a school. You want to know that they're being taken care of, and it's very hard to make quantitative judgments. And so I've sort of made some metrics here that are still quantitative. So hopefully that helps as well. So there's 4 things that I looked at: Islamic ? The full-time teacher to the full-time student ratio, the attendance, and the personal development extracurriculum / getting kicked out ? So I'll break this down quickly. Look, all these schools are marketed as Islamic schools. So like, I was surprised when I looked at my Instagram survey results. A lot of people don't necessarily care whether the school markets itself as Islamic or not. But you've got 2 schools, Amity and Alpha Omega, that do not market themselves as Islamic schools. So you won't see Islam being used as like a way of marketing to parents. Whereas if you look at all the other schools, being Islamic is very clearly in their name. So they will use like some Arabic word or something like that, / in the way that the school is presented on their website and social media channels. So you've got these 2, what I've just called secular for the sake of simplicity, schools, and that's Alpha and Amity. Nonetheless, I've included them in this analysis because predominantly they're Muslimic schools. They're predominantly teachers and students are Muslim, and the leadership, etc., follow a somewhat of an Islamic framework and all these other things. But they're not explicitly Muslim, is what I'm trying to say. The other thing, now before I move on, again, there's a big question mark as to, and I mentioned this at the top of the presentation, as to how Islamic is an Islamic school. And I gave the example of a school that used transliteration to teach kids how to learn Quran, and many bad things happen. Like, Islamic schools are not sort of insulated from things that just happen at every school. You're going to have people that are dating, you're going to have people that are taking drugs, you're going to have all these things that are normal for, I'm not saying normal in the sense that they should happen, but normal in the sense that things happen. And if you're catering for a mass market, you can't control for all of these variables. And so the judgment as to how comfortable you are aligning with how Islamic a school is or isn't, and then perhaps the stance within Islam that they take. So if they're Sufi, or if they're Salafi, or if they're like, modernist, like, depending on where you sit, that's a judgment that you need to make. It's a qualitative, value-based judgment that I don't want to make here, because I don't think I've got enough information, and I don't think it's the appropriate thing for me to be advising people on. So that's why I've sort of left the Islamic part, left it largely blank. Now, the other way that you're going to judge the well-being of a school would be how much attention your child gets. And how do you judge that? And I thought, okay, thinking of as like a consultant, let's take the data that I have. So I've got information on how many students are enrolled at the school, full-time students, and I've got data in terms of how many teachers they have. So if I look at the ratio, I would be able to sort of make a value judgment on how much attention my child would get if I was to send them in the school. So this has a range of between 10 and 24. And what I mean by that is Alpha Omega, for every student, for every 10 students, there's 1 teacher. And on the other hand, you have Al-Hikmah College, which for every 24 students, there's 1 teacher. So I think this is important because, like, you see here, for example, Alpha Omega is charging the higher fees, but they've got more attention because they've got more teachers compared to students than other schools. So again, like, if you look at the bottom of the table, you'll see what the median and the average is. And the median is 14 and the average is 15. Meaning, if you're looking at schools, you're on the better half of the spectrum if the school has less than 14 students per teacher, and you're on the worst half if you have more than 14 students per teacher. So for example, you see here that the more expensive schools, like even AIA Strathfield, has 11, so it's like very close to Alpha Omega. Whereas the schools typically down the bottom, they have like 17 or 20 as being something normal. So again, that's maybe just another consideration that you might want to take. The way that the government reports it is, it'll tell you the full-time teacher ratio. So it's not necessarily the number of teachers. If they've got, like, say, 2 teachers that are doing half a part-time load, that counts as 1 teacher. So to make it very fair, I'm using full-time teachers to full-time students. And the other thing is, I'm not including non-teaching staff. I'm not including the canteen lady and the office lady and the Mabarif Ish. I'm just including teachers. because that's what we're comparing. So it's an apples to apples comparison between all these schools. So I think that's very, very important to note that some schools lack in this regard. If you're considering that as a key metric to well-being, like I can't imagine, like speaking to my wife and also having taught informally here and there, I can't imagine managing things like more than 20 kids. I think it's very, very difficult. And so the ratio really matters. Whereas 10 kids is very, very manageable. And you can actually give the kids detailed feedback on their essays and marking and whatnot. You actually have the time and the headspace to do so. So I think that's a very important consideration for me, at least. The other thing with well-being is that what are some of like maybe the lag or like the lead indicators of well-being. So one of the things I looked at is attendance, because again, this is something that's available publicly on the My School's website. And like more or less, there's not much difference. Like most schools have like a 85% plus rating. If you do want to sort of put a rating, Al Faisal, Auburn and Campbelltown have 93%, and Muslim Girls Grammar has the worst with 84% attendance. And I think that's like, again, put it into real perspectives. Having an attendance that's close to 80 is like a student missing a day every single week. There's 5 days in the week. If you attend 4 days, you're going to get an attendance of 80. So I'm not sure what's happening. Like if a school has like a bad attendance rate, I think there's like question marks in terms of how serious the students are, how dedicated teachers are in terms of following up parents for unexplained absences, and all these other things, considerations that come about. So like I think that's important as a parent to consider as well. Now this last column within the well-being cluster is probably the most controversial. I know people have a lot of sensitive views on this, and this is the question as to like what are the extracurricular stuff, the personal development, etc. And like again, this is a qualitative judgment. This isn't something that I can sort of take a number that schools have to report in a standardized version to the government and sort of make a judgment on. So basically what I was going to do, but I decided not to, is call around the schools to ask them if they have a kick-out policy. So a kick-out policy is basically, okay, Ahmed, you're not performing as well as you should. Bye-bye, see you later. Or it could be subtle in the sense that, okay, Ahmed, you're not going to be able to sit the subjects that you want in year 11 and year 12. You're going to be given the crappy subjects that you have to go to TAFE to study. And that's just going to be a reason for you to leave our school. But I'm not forcing you. You can choose the door. The door's there for you if you want to go somewhere else. So there's these kick-out policies that are notorious at particular schools. I won't name names. But the idea here is that you need to understand where you sit with that. Are you comfortable with that pressure that is put onto students to stay up to scratch with the other kids, or is that something that you're not wanting to compromise on for the well-being of your child? I think that's a very, very important consideration that you should have as well. Undoubtedly, there's some schools that do way more extracurricular stuff, and what that then reflects sometimes is in lower academic schools. Like it's a trade-off, yeah. Like obviously some extracurricular stuff will help you with your academics, but not necessarily. So just a shout out to like a school that I haven't mentioned much of in this analysis, and that would be Unity Grammar. So in Austral, about 1,000 kids, paying about 3,000 a year, good ratio of about 13 students per teacher. With Unity Grammar, from all the schools that I've looked at, like I feel that they have the most extracurricular activities, and they also have the most, like they publicize it the most. Perhaps other schools do it as well, but they're doing very well when it comes to things like robotics. I think they go internationally to compete, and they've got many other things that they do as well. So I think that's something that you sort of want to consider. And like I think without foreshadowing it too much, it also comes down to the leadership approach that the school takes. So for example, like again, something that's like well documented is that Principal Tariq Beya at Alpha Omega is somewhat of a divisive figure in terms of how personal development is done. And obviously some people really like it and enjoy it and benefit from it, and some people don't. So like what I'm trying to say is that when you're looking at the well-being, there's the extracurricular stuff, but there's also the leadership style of the principal or the principals if it's a multiple campus, and the executive principal if it's, again, multiple campus. So that's just another thing to consider. So well-being, like if it's very, very important for you, then this is probably the stuff that you need to actually go and visit the school, speak to people, speak to parents. It's the most qualitative, non-statistic based thing that you can sort of review. Now, if you've sort of looked at your logistics, your finances, and your well-being, the next things you would look at would be your academics, and that's the NAPLAN and the HSC. Because I've already explained this in a little bit of detail on the previous slides, I'll go through this very quickly. So let's go by grade for NAPLAN, and we'll just do comparison. The reason I haven't done it by subject area is because it's impossible to compare a school that does just primary school, just high school, to a school that does K to 12. The numbers won't match if you look at it by subject. So instead, I've just done it by grade here in this table. So again, let's do ranges. So for NAPLAN Year 3, most recent results, the best results were for Al Faisal College, Campbelltown. And the worst results for Year 3 was Al Ma'arif school. This is the one that's near Auburn Glipley Mosque. It's a small primary school. Then for Year 5, the best results were for Al Faisal College, Campbelltown, and the worst results from this group was for AIA Strathfield. Then for Year 7, the best results were for Al Faisal College, Auburn campus, and the worst results were for Muslim Girls Grammar School. And again, like down below, you can see what the average and the median scores are. So you can actually see, okay, is this school just slightly off, or is it significantly off the pace when it comes to all these other schools that it's been compared to? Then for Year 9, the best one was Al Nouri Muslim School for NAPLAN, and the worst was Risala College. It's interesting, like one other point I was going to quickly mention before I move to HSC is that like you have these Muslim Achievers Awards and all these other things, and I think recently they've started this stuff around awarding teachers and schools for programs and stuff like that. But like having something out like this publicly, I don't know, like it feels like people don't want that. Like, for example, imagine there was an award ceremony that said, okay, best NAPLAN results for year 3, and there's a trophy for, I don't know, what school was it? Al Faisal College, Campbelltown. I think that those things about celebrating the wins of the teachers involved, of the students involved, are also important. Anyways, moving on to HSC, I've looked at a few variables here. This is very important. So, Abdurrahman, I know your kunya, but I don't know your real name. You can see here, I put the schools that have the IB. So out of all the Islamic schools, the only school that offers the IB as an alternative to the HSC is AIA, both at the Strathfield and the Kellyville campuses. And just quickly on them, they're obviously one of the more pricey ones that have about 4,500 to 5,000 on average school fees. And their student to teacher ratio, at least at the Strathfield campus, is pretty good. So they have the IB, so there's no way that I can give them a ranking or I can give them a distinguished achievers or all-rounders or anything like that. So just keep that in mind. That's why I've just highlighted that in blue. Now, what I've done here is I've looked at the last 3 years of rankings. Then I've looked at the success percentage or the distinguished achievers, and then I've looked at the all-rounder percentage as well. And I'll sort of explain this as well. So with the rankings, it's very simple. If you look at the last slide where I sort of showed the HSC rankings as a line graph, as a longitudinal thing, you can see that Alpha Omega is coming number 1 out of these schools, ranked 22. And last year, the school that came first was Al Faisal College. So again, this is an example where Al Faisal College's numbers are, come on, cuz. I think it's Mr. Huzn. If I'm not mistaken. So if we look at last year, we see that the top school was Al Faisal College. Now again, this is an example where Al Faisal College's things are macro level. So it's not broken down by campus, but Al Faisal College generally came 26 last year. So that was the highest out of all the other schools. And 2 years ago in 2020, the highest school ranking was Al Nouri. So you can see, like I said before, it's Al Nouri, Al Faisal, and Alpha Omega. If you're looking at HSC results, those are the that's the 3-horse race when it comes to the HSC. When you're looking at NAPLAN, the 3-horse race is between Al Faisal colleges in Auburn and Campbelltown and Al Nouri. So take of that what you will. Then there's the ranking is based off the success percentage or the distinguished achievers. So what this does is it looks at all the HSC exams that were set and counts the band 6s that were set, or the E4s, I think, in extension units. So the idea here is that obviously in the IB you don't have this because they're not sitting the HSC exams, and that's why there's no rankings for those schools. But arguably like PLC or something like that, or MLC, those independent schools that sit the IB, in many instances they would have scores better than a lot of the schools that are ranking in the top 10. So that's just another thing to consider. But anyways, when we're comparing it for HSC results, you're looking at the top, like James Roos, you typically get something like 60% success rate. So what that means is that out of every single exam that is sat for English, maths, etc., 60% are getting a band 6. And what's interesting about James Roos, I'll park that for a second, I'll come back to it. So you've got the success percentages, and the highest one was obviously Alpha Omega, and that's why they got the 22nd rank this year. So it was 36.6. But when you compare it to the school that came right after them, Al Faisal College, they were on 35.2. So we're talking about what, a percent difference of success rate. And with the cohorts that they're working with, this is like only a couple of students, like a few band 6s here and there, and these rankings can be flipped. But yeah, so it's very close, neck and neck, 22 and 23. And then if you go down a couple more, about 0.5%, you'll get to Al-Nouri. And that's an interesting thing as well, that at the top, the differences between success percentages is like significant. So like, I think you've got like James Roos on like 60, and then the rest of the schools are like on 40s. And then like once you're in the high 30s, you're like in the 20s and the 30s. So like the fraction percentage difference between each ranking gets smaller and smaller as the rankings go up. And then last thing before I move on from the success percentage is that another interesting fact is that if you guys recall on my Twitch stream, one night I was streaming and I was looking at a hypothesis that some of the Islamic schools, they force students to sit lower subjects so they can get more band 6s, so the ranking goes up. So I don't know if anyone remembers this. So like, okay, I'm a school, I want to market myself as the top ranking Islamic school. The smartest thing I could do is those kids that were meant to sit 4-unit maths and English, I get them to do standard English and maths. I get all of them to get band 6, and then therefore I get the top rank. But what I did was, and this was a painfully annoying task, is I went through the honor roll. So the honor roll is like what gets published every year. And if you get a band 6, you're on the honor roll. So what I did is I went through the schools and I counted how many kids in the top ranking schools and these top ranking 3 Muslim schools sat standard units. So how many of them sat standard English or standard maths? And what percentage of those band 6s added to the success percentage? And then what I did is I realized that they weren't any significantly different to all the other schools. Many of the schools have about 10% of their band 6s coming from standard English or standard maths. So it wasn't a sort of reason, like there's no evidence to the argument that someone at Al Faisal College is basically forcing kids to sit lower units, or at any other school, Malik Fahad or Alpha or something like that. That argument doesn't sort of hold any water from a statistical perspective. And what was interesting, and the last thing before I move on, is the best schools, so like James Roos, for example, they get a 60% plus success rate without even one student sitting standard English or standard maths. So like it's phenomenal that like these schools are doing so well, despite the fact that they're giving them kids the hardest subjects to do. So like even if you were to compare them on that metric, the 60% is like higher if you think about it. Like if they got their kids to sit the same subjects that all the other schools were sitting, the success percentage would be even higher. So that's why they're sort of unchallenged for the last however many years that they've come first. Anyways, then you've got the all-rounder. So the all-rounder percentage is what percentage of students get a band 6 in every subject that they sat. Obviously, that's very difficult. And so the highest in this regard was Al-Nouri. So even though Al-Nouri is ranked 4 positions behind Alpha, it did better from an all-rounder perspective. So kids that got band 6 in everything is about 8.3% versus 6.7% for Alpha. These numbers have stayed relatively consistent. I think Alpha's all-rounder score actually jumped higher. I think previous years it's been about 3 or 4%. So it's actually gone well. And again, going back to James Roos, I think their all-rounder percentage is like 50%. Like over half the kids are getting band 6 in every single subject, which is crazy. And no one comes close to that. Okay, so then you've got the academic side. So you've got the NAPLAN and the HSC, and like it's a very clear picture from at least from the HSC sitting subject schools where everyone sits. Then you've got the reputation. Now, again, this is arguably like one of the most difficult things to look at, but I have, and again, this was a point in time, so things might have changed. But basically, you've got the leadership. So I've just colored the male principals in blue and the females in pink. So it's gendered colors, whatever. And obviously, like if you go onto the LinkedIn and you research these people, you will learn more about their qualifications, their style towards education, their background, etc. So I think it's very, very important to take this into consideration when you're looking at a school, because naturally the person leading the organization, in this instance the school, will have knock-on effects onto everything below them. And the last thing I looked at from a reputation perspective was the average review. So what I did is I looked at the reviews on Google, I looked at the reviews on Facebook, and I looked at the reviews on that website, the Ed Arabia website that looks at for international students. And basically I've put like what the average review was. And so, and for multiple campuses like Malik Fahad, I looked at multiple campus pages or whatever to basically be able to sort of combine them as an average. So the range was 4.7. So the highest was again Alpha Omega. I think they've got a lot of very positive reviews. I think a lot of parents that have had a positive experience leave many reviews. So that's interesting to hear. And then on the other hand, you have two, again, this is a 5-point rating, 5-star rating. So on 2, you've got Islamic College of Sydney. This is the one again to Mount Druitt. So the thing here is that, to be honest, you want to take these reviews with a bit of a grain of salt. Like anyone who's run a business knows that you can have people that you've never interacted with and they leave a bad review on your business. You have haters, you have competitors, you have other things that can sort of skew that. It can also be your marketing department. If you have really good marketing, you can tell your marketing team or your agency to basically go and incentivize parents to leave good reviews. You get a 5% discount or 10% discount if you leave a good review. So like there's all these things that happen. So reviews are not generally the best thing to look at. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that if you see hundreds of reviews or dozens of reviews and you read the reviews like I have, and I really encourage everyone to read the reviews of the schools that they're thinking of putting their kids into, you actually get a really good vibe as to two things. One is, what's the general sentiment around the school? So for example, if you see like heaps of 1-star reviews and they're saying the same thing, like there's a school, I won't name its name, there's a school that's like being pounded on Google for its inconsistent policies, its nepotism, and all these other things. And it's just every single week, 1 or 2 parents genuinely leaving a review. And like if you see that building up over a series of months and there's like dozens of these negative reviews saying the exact same thing about the exact same teacher and the exact same principal, then you know with a lot more certainty that this isn't made up. This isn't some conspiracy. It's like mutawatir almost, if you want to think about it from a hadith perspective. So if you get that degree of confidence in reviews, I would avoid particular schools off the basis of this. And secondly, like I said, there's 2 things that you learn from. The second thing is, how responsive is the school? If the school is literally seeing these negative reviews and not saying anything, not communicating, not clearing the air, then I think that's really bad on the school's part. And it shows that, like, if you have a bad experience with the school, are they actually going to call you back? Are they actually going to deal with your feedback? Are they going to deal with your criticism? Because I'm pretty sure every parent, before they go to Google and they stoop down to the level of leaving a 1-star review and a negative comment, I'm pretty sure they contacted the school. I'm pretty sure, I'm not in all cases, but I'm thinking about myself and the people I know, you would try to make amends with the school. You would contact the office, you would call the school, you would try to book a meeting with the principal. And like that's probably like, once all else fails, like you resort to like bad mouthing on social media. So I think the reputation of schools is largely contingent upon their reviews that I think every person should read, and the leadership, and you should know who's in the senior leadership of these schools and their campuses and their departments, because these are the people that are sort of basically leading where your child is going. So it's important like that. It's similar to like how if you were reviewing stocks, you would want to know who the CEO is. And one of the moats that Warren Buffett talks about is the leadership team as well. So that's important as well. Lastly, other things. So I've looked at the privilege percentile. And this is because, like, again, you don't want to come across as snobby and stuff like that, but you do want to compare how educated are the parents that your son is in a class or your daughter's in a class. How educated are the parents of the people that are sitting next to your children? How well off are they from that perspective? And all these other things. Now, again, it doesn't necessarily mean that if people are educated and they have money that they're going to be good people, but more or less, like, you would want your kids to be in that similar flock. And so that's why I've put the percentile, and the highest percentile goes to Al Hikmah College with a 91 percentile, and the lowest goes to Muslim Girls Grammar School, again in Granville, with a 46 percentile, so even below the national average there. So again, these are things to consider. I'm not again saying that you make your decision based off one of these things or any things, but like look at this in totality, and based off what you value, you can make a decision. The second last thing I looked at was how many of them speak only English at home. This is a very secondary, tertiary consideration. Like it's not important, but for me, I would want to know to what extent is Arabic or the native tongue that people migrated with being preserved in the language repertoire of children that are going to these schools. So for example, it ranges between 0. So it's interesting that there's some schools like AIA Strathfield and Al Faisal Auburn and Campbelltown and Islamic College of Sydney in Mount Druitt. These 4 schools have no students that only speak English at home, meaning all of them will speak English and Urdu or Arabic or other languages that they may be acquainted to because of their parents. So I think that's a good metric because it shows you that these kids are not whitewashed into like a curry parent who talks only English to their kids. I find that just really orcs. On the other hand, you have Arcana College, again, completely different demographic, different part of Sydney. You have them with 37% only speaking English. So that's just an interesting thing to know. Then you've got VET. So I was looking at this, but I decided not to sort of go into detail about it. But this is like what alternative paths to the HSC does the school provide? So does the school provide TAFE courses? Does it provide courses that are not necessarily border studies indoors? So you're not going to get an ATA out of them. But if you want to pick up a trade or pick up something else, you can do so. So that's another consideration. So that I thought people can add in. So if you think that, okay, my child may not want to go to university or academics is not for my child, then you would want to look at the schools that have the best VET provisions, and that's on the MyGov website. So in summary, the school that's the best is up to you. You look at the metrics, you look at the schools that are consistently coming high on those metrics, and you make a decision based off what's important to you. And as I said, do your own research. Go and read the reviews. Go and visit these schools. Go and try to book a one-on-one with the principal. Go and ask them for like what's their plan for the school and all these other things. But if you're taking it on the apparent, like I say with the suburbs, it's a personal judgment. I might like something, you might like something else. I might find something important, you might not. So always take that into consideration. And I think the other thing I was going to say was, this is a very important decision that you're going to make. Where you put your kid ultimately determines a large part of their future. It's not the only thing that determines that, but it is something that I think people should take more seriousness when they're actually considering it. So I'll basically conclude there. Are there any questions as I move to the final slide? Just as a reminder. So again, as I conclude, the reminder is that when I'm looking at the school, like this is, Muslim schools is just one little thing under Islam that is a criteria for judging where you would live. If you value your kids going to an Islamic school as opposed to homeschooling or as opposed to other schools, then I think this analysis would have been useful for you. If not, like if you're already on the fence that, okay, I'm going to send my kids to a Christian school, I'm going to send them to an independent school, or I'm going to send them to a government school, I think nonetheless there's been some useful frameworks and variables that you can probably use to sort of judge which school you would want to send your kids to. So if there's no further questions, I'll probably end it there.